Hello and welcome to another edition of The Front Page, a joint production of GNAT-TV and the Manchester Journal. My name is Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal. It's my privilege to be your host today, and today we're going to have a special guest I think that you'll all find very interesting to hear from. They say that death and taxes are the two constants in life, and while we can't do a whole lot about the former, there's often a lot of conversation that seems to go on about the second part of that, taxation. So who else to enlighten us a little bit about that than a former tax commissioner himself, Mr. Thomas Pelham. Tom, welcome to GNAT.
Very glad to be back in some old home turf.
That's right. Tom is sort of a story of a hometown boy made good here. He's a former resident of Arlington, a graduate of the 1967 class of Arlington High School. Oh, right. Yeah, well, wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
And then went on to a brilliant career in state government. He's been a former tax commissioner in the Douglas administration, was also a former finance commissioner in the Howard Dean administration, and was also the deputy secretary of administration in the Douglas administration, and also a state representative from the town of Calais up in the Northeast Kingdom. Well, Tom, welcome back to the old homestead here, and I guess just to kind of get things rolling, we've had a lot of things happen in the last couple of weeks in state government. New administration taking office in Montpelier, new governor coming in, a new biennium in the legislature, and several new proposals coming out about taxation or that involve taxes in one way or another. Let's just sort of set the framework here and go back a couple of weeks to when Governor Peter Shumlin gave his budget address, I think on January 30th. What was your reaction to that as from the tax angle as a former tax commissioner? Do you think his proposals made sense or what?
The tone of it is one that I agree with many others, that Governor Douglas could have been given that speech. Governor Shumlin was very strong on there being no new taxes, that our tax capacity is depleted. And it's interesting to watch as he went through the campaign. You know, if you remember when his tax returns were made public, he said, well, people like me should be paying more taxes.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And I think that's the position you have to take in the Democratic primary, which are rich people. You know, there's a class of rich people in Vermont, and they should pay more taxes. But, you know, as you get closer and closer to the governor's chair, and in the general election, you tend to get more and more conservative for some good reasons, which we can talk about in a minute. So I liked the tone. The substance is one that the jury is still out, in my view. You have a Democratic governor and a very liberal Democratic legislature, and at the end they might compromise somewhere in the middle, which is more taxes. Maybe not as much as some in the legislature would like, but certainly more than there is now. And in the governor's budget, there's quite a bit of the 2012 proposal, which is funded by one-time money. You have $29 million of carry forward from fiscal year 2011 to 2012, which is only one time and is going to be a pressure in the next year. You have $36 million of carry forward global commitment money, which can be used in 2012. Obviously, you do have new taxes on hospitals and providers and dentists. So it's a patched together budget, and with a lot of howling from very powerful advocates, the mental health community and others. So when the legislature needs to sit down and say, okay, well, how do we feed these organizations a little bit more than the governor allowed them, but you still have a $176 million deficit that you're looking at. How do you solve that problem? So the jury's still out, and I'm seasoned enough in this to know that Shap Smith and Peter Shumlin have always conversed. Senator Campbell and Peter Shumlin have conversed, and we'll see whether by the time we get to the end of the session, whether this hard, we can live within our means stand is the one that prevails.
Well, particularly with a $176 million budget deficit to close, I mean, it would seem almost impossible to do that from the outside anyway, and not raise taxes somehow. I mean, one of the pledges that I remember candidate Shumlin making was the no new broad-based taxes, and maybe we should take a minute to talk about what exactly is a broad-based tax. So that's a term I think a lot of people probably have heard a lot about, but I imagine that's income tax or sales tax or something that affects a broad mass of the population.
Well, I think that's what he means, but it could mean that even within a broad-based tax structure, income tax, property tax, sales tax, if some subcomponent of that pays more, maybe that's within his definition. If you remember 2 years ago, the year that the governor vetoed the budget bill, they removed a lot of exemptions from the income tax and lowered the income tax rate partially, but didn't use all the money that they saved to lower it as far as they could have. And so was that a broad-based tax or not? The income tax certainly is a broad-based tax, but the exemptions that exist within that tax are often not broad-based, and so we'll see.
Well, one of the other things that the governor spoke about in that address was the whole Challenges for Change initiative, which very highly touted last year, much talked about. It sounded quite interesting, actually. The governor basically said, well, we're done with that, at least as I read his speech anyway.
In terms of education especially.
Right. Is it fair to say that Challenges for Change was last year's phenomenon and has now gone by the board and we're kind of just back to business as usual?
I think we need to put Challenges for Change in context. And so let me give you a little history here. We weren't in a recession in 2008. And in 2008, state spending was about $4.544 billion. That's exactly what it was. And through 2008, 2009, 2010, and through the current budget that we're in now, 2011, state spending grew at a rate of 4.62%. Now, inflation has been plus or minus 1 or 2%. Yeah, and we are in a recession, and there are demands on human services, especially for more services. The human service budget has grown at an average annual rate of over 7%. So you've got to some extent, the legislature and the governor are being hoisted on their own petards. And I think Shumlin said this in his speech. He said, we used all the ARRA money. There is no more ARRA money. We knew this day would come. I think that's a quote, and it's here. Right. But the issue I think for taxpayers is who gets holding the bag at the end of this process. If over those 3 years the legislature had even met the governor halfway in terms of his proposals and had grown state spending at 2% instead of 4.5%, we'd have no deficit at all. If you start with where we were in 2008 and you grow that budget by 2% a year, you end up in a place where there is no $176 million problem. There's none at all. And there's precedent for that. Howard Dean did that. Howard Dean had one-time money, which were the tax increases passed by Ralph Wright and Governor Snelling, and he used it wisely. He basically flattened the bottom of the recession so that when we came out of the recession, our revenues and our spending met up again, and the taxes could be sunset. This time around, the legislature had ARRA funds, one-time money,
stimulus money,
from the stimulus money from the federal government. But instead of flatlining or even modestly growing state spending, they grew, for example, human services by 7% a year, overall almost 5% a year. And so now the ARRA money's gone, and we still have this wide gap, $176 million between our revenues that we're going to get from the current laws, and the spending pressures. So this isn't. The legislature is not a victim here. It's a choice, and it seems that Governor Shumlin has made the choice. Okay, well, I was part of the problem. Now I'm going to be part of the solution. I'm not going to make the taxpayers the solution. We're going to live within our means. I haven't heard that as clearly from the legislature yet. Right. So we'll see where this ends up.
Well, one of the other things that happened back in January up in Montpelier was the release of I guess it's fair to say, a long-awaited report from the so-called Blue Ribbon Tax Commission, a group of, I guess we'll call them experts, who devised some recommendations about how the state might restructure its taxing formulas. I guess two things sort of were key in their recommendation. One was to base the state tax on, let me see if I got this right, federal taxable income.
Yes.
Instead of adjusted gross income?
No, to base it on adjusted gross income
as opposed
instead
to
of federal taxable income.
Right. I know a lot of states do that now.
Yep. Most states do that.
Right. So we would be joining the majority. And then the other big proposal that got a lot of attention was reducing the sales tax from 6 to 4.5%, but broadening that to include services. So, as a former tax commissioner, would you be cheering for this, or no?
I'm probably a cheerleader in most regards. I know Kathy Hoyt was my boss in the Dean administration, and she was one of the people that probably more liberal than I, but she understood the need to balance the budget and to sunset those taxes, and so she has very good seasoned instinct. Bill Sayre is just inherently conservative, and I don't know Mr. Schupart that well, but it was a good team of people. I've read the report. I generally agree with it. There's some very interesting information in there that I don't think is we should talk about this, is publicly embraced yet, but should be as we go into whether or not we can raise more taxes. And it's also not inconsistent with what Governor Douglas did. If you'll remember, Governor Douglas proposed unitary combined for corporate tax,
Right.
Which I won't get into the details, but it was a way of basically shifting more of the tax burden appropriately onto interstate and businesses, but being able to lower the rate for everybody. So we had a top tax rate on our corporate folks in Vermont of 9.5%, which we were ranked fifth highest in the nation, and he was able to lower the rate to 8.5%, which tied us with New Hampshire at 17%. So it's basically broadening your base and lowering the rates, and Governor Douglas did that dollar for dollar. I mean, that was the promise, and that was the calculation, and I think that's why it wasn't contentious. The governor also proposed, Governor Douglas, to eliminate the capital gains exemption on most income, except for those for farmers, small businesses, and people over 65, to allow them to keep the exemption. The legislature eliminated it for almost everybody, including those 65 and over, which I think is a mistake, but that's what they've done. But then they lowered the rates only part way of what they could, and they kept in that veto override about $13 or $14 million for increased spending. So the concept of making the tax code simpler, broader, and lowering rates, I think, is a good one. But let's see if that's what they do. There's some concern, and I think legitimate concern, that the legislature will repeat what they did in 2010, which is broaden the base, but not lower the tax rates as much as possible, but to use that as a way to raise more money to maybe not have to resolve all this $176 million problem on the revenue side.
One of the deductions I understand that would be taken out when we shift over to the adjusted gross income as being the sort of the bottom line here is the home mortgage deduction. And I think there's been some talk already of people being a little, wait a minute, I bought my home based on the fact that I was going to have a tax deduction here.
Yep.
Housing industry in Vermont is not exactly hale and hearty at the moment. I mean, do you feel that this is maybe not a good time to do that?
Well, I don't think that you have to push. I think that for example, the home mortgage deduction is a federal policy, and it applies equally, across all states at the federal level. Most states do not pass that through in their state tax code, but Vermont does.
Okay.
And you are right that people have made decisions based on that. In the same way, I could argue with Act 60 that people made decisions about where to live and schools to, send their kids to pre-Act 60. Take, for example, Williston, which was going to pay for their schools with all the development around Taft's Corner, and then Act 60 came along and said, oh, that's not your local economic engine, it belongs to the state. So those things do happen. But I think that you can phase these things in. That you can analytically go in and look at the turnover in the housing market, the buying and selling, and kind of the average tenure of people owning a home. Clearly, I think with us baby boomers coming through, there's going to be quite a bit of turnover, and phase these reforms in over time, as long as you do it in a revenue neutral way. If you're trying to raise money, then to solve a current problem, then the pressure's on you to make more immediate decisions. But if your policy strategy is to be revenue neutral, then as these exemptions phase out, the tax rate should go down, and you can do it that way without pushing some homeowners over a cliff.
Well, I know I've heard some conversations along those lines that, wait a minute, we're getting too close to home here. But anyway, you mentioned Act 60 in the course of your last answer, and I know that Act 60 and education spending is a subject you've thought a great deal about. So let me just say, where do you see that all going? Are we making any headway at all in terms of controlling education spending, or kind of right-sizing it, or coming up with a way of paying for education in the state that's not going to be quite as contentious? Or are we still floating downstream and just things are getting worse all the time?
Well, I'm fearful that we're still floating downstream. Two issues. Number one is the way the current education financing system works is a little bit of musical chairs. Some people are protected to a degree and some taxpayers aren't. Homeowners are protected to a degree because they have income sensitivity. And so in the end, the property taxpayer left holding the bag is the non-residential property taxpayer. And I think this is a very serious issue in terms of downtown development and downtown retail economic health that really people haven't grabbed onto yet. I'll just give you a statistic that, the year after the passage of Act 68 in 2005, non-residential property taxpayers paid $388 million into the education fund. This year, they will be billed for $559 million. That's a $173 million increase, $173 million increase at a growth rate of 6.4% per year. During that same period of time, the student population dropped from 99,900 to 92,000. So the way it's structured is the property taxpayer holding the bag in the end to meet the spending collectively voted by local voters is a non-residential property taxpayer. And I believe there is a direct relationship between that and all the vacant stores that you see in Rutland and Barry and growing in Montpelier and Church Street. Those are your non-residential property taxpayers. And so as those businesses go out, and you have a natural kind of creative destruction, a turnover in businesses in any area, but the new person comes in with the landlord, has to calculate what that property tax is, and if they're looking at a tax collectively across the state that's going up well over 6% a year, even though the kid count is dropping, they're not going to have business growth in the 6% a year. And so these places are just being left vacant. So you have an education funding policy that is sucking the economic blood out of many of our retail centers, and I understand Manchester, has quite a few vacancies itself. Right. But you go to Springfield and Bennington and Rutland, even population lost, are going down. But Rutland has a lot of downtown vacancies. All those buildings are non-residential buildings. They're all subject to the property tax, and I just think it's gone too far.
So what's the alternative then? If we were to overhaul Act 68 or throw it out entirely, what would we replace it with?
Well, I'm not quite sure. The Governor Douglas proposed a number of proposals, and they were all rejected. And I don't think they were rejected based on the fact that they were not thoughtful. For example, he had one proposal where school district spending on a per pupil basis over the statewide average would need a 60% plurality to pass that budget, so that those that are good soldiers and spending below the average are held harmless. Governor Shumlin has been much more brutal about it. He came in and proposed, and it's his proposals to take $23 million of the general fund transfer and send it back to the general fund. Now that's equivalent to 2 cents on the tax rate. And it's interesting to me that you've heard no screams from the NEA or anybody else. Jeff Francis from the Principals Association, School Boards Association, they're all kind of quiet. But this is $23 million. If Governor Douglas did that, it would be the headline would be, Governor raised education fund, property taxes to go up. Right. So, so it's going to be interesting to me to see where this goes, because maybe it's Nixon going to China. Maybe it just is, who makes the proposal. What's interesting to me is if you can go on the Joint Fiscal Office website today, You can see their education outlook of the education fund. And for the very next year, fiscal year 2013, that education fund is operating in the red with Governor Shumlin's proposal, operating in the red, and the rainy day fund is totally drained. It's gone. And so in addition to, if you have to replenish the education fund, which is about $30 million, that's another 3 cents on the tax rate. So something's got to break here in the next couple of years. I'm very surprised at the business community, though, that they just kind of take this lying down.
Yeah.
There's no pushback. The property taxes are just depleting their ability to do business in the traditional Vermont centers. And at the same time, we expand programs like the Vermont Housing Conservation Board and downtown tax credits to try to put a fig leaf on this problem. A lot of people talk about the traditional Vermont development patterns, and that's a good thing, I think. I'm certainly not for sprawl, but on the one hand, you can't be sucking the blood out of these downtowns through a property tax system where these downtown buildings are the last resort for property taxes, and at the same time is, oh, by the way, I'm going to give you a little tax credit over here to band-aid the problem over.
Yeah, well, I've long been surprised too that the business community overall hasn't really made more of a stink about all of that, but they do. Again, overall, that does not seem to be. The mute button seems to be on there to some degree. But I wanted to ask you one other aspect of this, which I know you've written about before, and that's the whole income sensitivity aspect of it. I mean, my take on that is that we are reaching the point where we're putting a lot of money into the income sensitivity program. And I guess my question is, how much longer do you think we can continue to pump money into that at the current levels?
We'll see where it goes. The legislature a couple years ago took their first small bite at trying to constrain that by basically weighing more heavily dividend and interest income for folks that have dividend and interest income, and capping the level of the benefit at $8,000, I think, is the maximum, and also capping the maximum house value at $500,000. Income sensitivity has been growing leaps and bounds, in part because the government has expanded the program. It used to be a $75,000 cap. Now it's a $90,000 cap. But income sensitivity now is the second largest line item in the education fund. We spend more on income sensitivity than we do on special education. And what's interesting is the Brigham decision doesn't speak at all to income sensitivity. Income sensitivity is not a requirement of the Brigham decision. If it went away completely, there would be no effect relative to Brigham. And it's just a program of transferring wealth from one group of people to another group of people. And I think, and others do as well, that it has been one of the reasons why budgets have been going up so strongly, even though the child count has been dropping dramatically, is because lots of people are, to a great degree, not a total degree, but to a great degree, held harmless from the consequences of their own vote. In Manchester, if you want to buy a new plow, it's $40,000, and you raise your hand and you support it. You dig into your pocket and you pay for it. And on the school budget, if you raise your hand and support for it, and most people can't even figure out how it's paid for, but you know that if you're income sensitized, you get that check, in July. And so I think, well, somebody else is going to pay for it, so why not? And it's a system that is the fundamental economics of it are out of balance.
Well, once again, you provided me with the perfect segue into one of the last topics I wanted to talk about was the prebate decision that was recently handed down at the Bennington Superior Court.
There's one topic I do want to go back to briefly, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, since the prebate tax question that our local town officials here are kind of trying to work through a position on whether or not to appeal that decision by the Superior Court, sort of revolves around income sensitivity payments. At least originally, that's where the question comes from, whether or not that information should be public knowledge or not. As I'm sure you well know, the town has tried to withhold that information and was unsuccessful in defending that position in Superior Court. And now we're talking here in between two select board meetings where by the time some folks who are watching this may already be a moot point, but are still kind of trying to work out a position whether or not to appeal that further to the state Supreme Court. But I guess again, what do you feel about that? Do you think the town's position that this should not be public information? These income sensitivity, I guess tax credits would be probably the better way to put them, since it's money that goes directly from the state coffers to the town clerk's office, I guess, rather than in the form of an individual check to individual taxpayers or households. Is that public, or should it be private?
The actual income sensitivity benefit is printed on the property tax bill. And those have always been public information in Vermont, where local people can see, who's paying what. I believe in transparency. This is a program that is transferring money from one group of taxpayers to another, taking it out of our downtown business community and giving it to eligible homeowners. It's a very generous program, up to $90,000. People don't have to partake in it if they don't want to take. There are a whole bunch of noise in the system about being able to apply your refund of property taxes, double weighting, triple weighting dividend income, the $500,000 cap, so that to be able to calculate somebody's income precisely is not generally possible. But I would agree that someone can get a rough relationship. But on the other hand, here you have a program which has been growing in leaps and bounds. Here's a program that affects how people vote at town meeting in terms of whether or not they support a budget. It's a program that's based on income, not on wealth. So in my old hometown, some folks that got the largest benefit were trust funders. Their parents bought them the home. They didn't have any mortgage. They had a pretty nice life. They traveled to Spain. Another couple lived in a very beautiful house, had a summer home up in Blue Hill, Maine, but they were getting a huge income sensitivity payment. Whereas some other folks, who lived down the street, both worked very hard. Their combined income pushed them over the limit. They didn't get any benefit. So you have these folks that are trust funders to a great extent, having their property taxes being paid by charging downtown businesses higher property taxes, and these other folks with dual income, but that pushed them, above the income limit, not getting any benefit. So, I think it being public will make some people nervous. They won't want to know people to know that they're getting the benefit in the first place. If they don't want people to know, don't apply.
All right. So transparency trumps the rest of it in this case. Now, we have a few minutes left, so you wanted to go back to one of the
I wanted to go back to the tax reform report, which was one of the very interesting things in there is I think putting a pinprick into an understanding about Vermont taxes that just doesn't carry water. That is about taxing the wealthy. There's a whole genre of folks in Vermont that believe that our government finance problems will be solved very easily if we just tax the rich. The Public Assets Institute came out with this proposal that basically the state collect the tax amounts that wealthy Vermonters get because of the Bush tax cuts weren't repealed. And there's some truth in that. I mean, there are some wealthy people in Vermont, but in the tax reform report is an interesting profile of who the wealthy are in Vermont. And they looked over an 8-year period at all the people who filed Vermont income tax forms greater than $500,000 in adjusted gross income. And what they found is that 52% of those, there were only 3,900 of them. Keep in mind there's 330,000 income tax filers in the state of Vermont every year. This population was only 3,900, less than 1%, a little bit more than 1%. And of those 3,900, 52% only filed once in that cohort out of the 8-year period, and 70% only filed twice. And generally, there were about maybe 200 or 300 filers that filed over $500,000 for each year of that 8-year period. And so what this, and when you look at that more deeply, you'll find that many of those folks that are the one-time wealthy, and the tax reform report calls them event wealthy as opposed to really wealthy. But these event wealthy folks are basically hardworking people in Vermont approaching retirement. Maybe they had an auto body shop or a printing business, or what you can think of, dozens and dozens of things, and they get close to retirement and they cash it in. So so when people think about, I want to raise taxes on the wealthy, and you're really talking about taxing the retirement income of middle class, middle income Vermonters, that's one thing. If you just think somehow you're getting the rich out of stater and the oil baron
the hedge fund manager
or the head of
right.
AIG or something like
Right.
that, then you don't feel so bad about it.
Right.
But that is I think a valuable contribution that this report has given. That there isn't a wealthy class in Vermont that we can just go
Yep.
and say give us more without doing any harm.
Right.
We're taxing regular Vermonters when we reach to tax the wealthy more.
Well, Tom, thanks so much for being with us today and sharing your insights about all of this and unraveling some of the mysteries to some of the more math-challenged folks like myself on this. It's really interesting stuff, and it'll certainly be very exciting to watch, well, at least interesting. Well, probably exciting, too, as the legislature and the governor work forward to some solutions to these big problems. And thanks again to all of you for watching. This has been the Front Page on GNAT-TV. My name's Andrew McKeever, Managing Editor of the Manchester Journal. Been a pleasure. We'll see you next time.